Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. Before we get into the second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you, as always, if you feel so inclined and you want to contribute and interact with our shows around the network a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features, as well as potentially leaving tips and donations as well through YouTube itself, as well as our website, GSMCpodcast.net. It's a great way to, as I always say, get your opinions on air as well. I love when this show is as interactive as possible. It just makes it that much better, and we genuinely appreciate all you do for us here at the GSMC Sports Network. But without further ado, let's jump right into our second segment, our second off-season guide of the day. Moving to the LA Chargers. A pretty successful first year of the Jim Harbaugh regime saw him implement his philosophies heavily on this Chargers squad, saw them move to that more run-heavy approach he is known for. Obviously, it limited Justin Herbert's ability to turn the ball over in a nice manner. So that was one of the big positives, but also I feel like this defense was a big surprise, especially considering how young it was, especially in that secondary as well. I still think that there can be a couple of moves made defensively, but if I'm Jim Harbaugh, I'm continuing to build up this offense, especially this offensive line. You now have your two bookend tackles for not just the present, but the future as well, in both Rashawn Slater and Joe Alt. But the interior of this offensive line is what's going to be important, especially if you want to keep implementing the run game, especially in zone schemes like he is apt to do. So that's one major thing, and then I do think there can be a little bit more rejiggering considering that defense, especially in that secondary as well, to allow for all the versatile players within that group to really coalesce and develop in their own rights. But ultimately, I'm really intrigued to see how, heading into this offseason, Jim Harbaugh begins to approach this offense, especially because not only do I feel like if you want to continue running the football, you need good guard play, but you need a little bit more winners on the perimeter in the receiving game. Ladd McConkey was elite all year long in his abilities as a possession receiver to move the football, but you need more guys who can stretch the defense a little bit more vertically, especially if you find yourselves in third and long situations. So that could be another position of need that I think they can address in this year's draft, and we can get into that a little bit later on. But let's start off talking about how to upgrade this interior offensive line, because the Chargers' running game, yes, at certain points it was solid, maybe even enough to pull games out in certain situations. But I think that when you rank 17th in yards per game at 110.7, that's not necessarily where you want to be, even if you are a run-happy offense. I feel like if you can't pick up blocks for your running back as a pulling guard, the chances are your running game does get stagnant. And so if they don't upgrade this interior offensive line, then what's the point of trying to implement more run schemes? And the fact that you have two bookend tackles leads me to believe you're more of a passing attack, which they are definitely not. So Jim Harbaugh has to address those more aptly, because he knows that he has two bookend tackles who can protect Herbert if need be. But I do think that if this continues, and if this philosophy is the path forward for the Los Angeles Chargers, you gotta buy into it, because you can't just abandon it immediately just because you don't necessarily have the resources. But then, in terms of, like I said, this receiving core, Ladd McConkey proved that he was a very apt position receiver, very important in this scheme. But ultimately, I want to see a winner in terms of verticality, someone who can stretch the defense, someone who can run the seams potentially. And I think that would be fantastic and very, very appropriate if Jim Harbaugh reunites with his buddy Colston Loveland from Michigan and they draft him and implement him in this roster. Because having a pass-catching tight end is very vital in a run-heavy offense, especially when you need someone to move the sticks on third and manageable situations. And Colston Loveland isn't just your typical pass-catching tight end. He can stretch the defense in line, in the seam, and really is a very talented player, especially when you want him to win over the middle. So I think that opens up a lot of avenues for this wide receiving core, especially because of the abilities of a guy like Lat McConkey as well. Allows him to get more open in certain routes. Potentially allows for Quentin Johnston to have more opportunities as well, not just over the middle, but in terms of verticality. So I do think the diversity of this wide receiving core, not just this tight end core, would get even more better. I don't know why they're double negative or double positive there, but ultimately it would get better if a guy like Colston Loveland, who can really alter how an offense looks in the passing game, comes to them through the draft. But ultimately, in terms of addressing this offensive line, I feel like you can have a lot of options available to you in free agency if you're the Chargers. I feel like you drafted your bookend tackles, but it's harder to find an elite guard in a draft. So I would, if I were them, address the guard positions in the interior of this offensive line specifically through free agency. Guys like Will Hernandez, Mekhi Becton, Aaron Banks all make sense. And I feel like since you have a lot of cap space with $91 million, you definitely can make a lot of moves and wouldn't necessarily have to be too aggressive or overpay or overcompensate for these players. I feel like all of these players are at points in their career where they're constantly improving and they may not have even reached their peak. And so that's why I think this Chargers team should not be hasty in the draft. Because if you try and draft guards rather than tackles who feel more complete coming out of college than guards because of all the movement along a college offensive line compared to an NFL offensive line, you're going to have to hedge your bets on the free agent market. And it's luckily that there are a lot of options there for you available who are versatile in their own right. But then let's start talking about this defense, because I feel like the offense is simple to improve. Try and get Colston Loveland on draft night and then look to free agency to improve the interior offensive line. But the defense is a little bit difficult because you have a lot of talent in your secondary, but you need to make sure that continuity is integral and development is integral as well. And I think an under-the-radar move that they'll make is re-signing safety Elijah Molden, who ranks second amongst DBs in tackles and interceptions, to the point where he broke his leg in Week 17. So I do think that even though he's not the most integral part of the secondary, it allows a defensive coordinator like Jesse Minter to move around the most versatile player in that secondary, Derwin James, to do a lot more work playing nickel, because it brings him closer to the line. He creates a lot more coming downfield, coming downhill in the backfield, and I do feel like that is very impactful if you're the LA Chargers because of what diversity this secondary brings week in, week out. You have a lot of guys who play well in coverage, but you have a guy like Derwin James who likes to come downhill and wreak havoc. So if I'm them, I'm reciting safety Elijah Molden, not necessarily because he's the best player or defensive back in that secondary, but he allows defensive coordinator Jesse Minter a lot of different ways to manipulate his defense. And I really like the tenor of that, because last year, Derwin James, coming off a couple injuries, hadn't really seen steady improvement over the first couple of years of his career. Finally returned to that all-pro level at 5.5 sacks, a career high for him last season. It just goes to show that you kind of need the depth necessary to sustain special players in this defense like Derwin James. Speaking of special players in this defense, but particularly aging players as well, let's talk about how they might try and navigate this Khalil Mack situation, whether or not they re-sign him. He took a pay cut last year to stay on this team, and he did get a guarantee this year that he would not be franchise tagged, and that leaves a lot of different avenues on whether or not he can be extended, on whether or not they let him go. But he does turn 34 next month. So I do think that there are one of two options where LA can pick up a young D lineman in the draft potentially, or look to sign him on a short-term deal. Because if you promise a player he's not going to get franchise tagged, and this player seemingly is willing to play for you for however long is necessary, I do think that an agreement can be made, because he is one of, if not your most talented linebackers and front seven talents as well. And you really want to hammer home that this pass rush isn't fading out, because they are an elite pass rush when everyone is healthy. But you do have to consider, or start to consider if you're at LA, the age of Khalil Mack, and decide whether or not you want to take a chance in this very deep defensive class on a young talent, because that's what you did with your offensive line to an extent. Find bookend tackles, and then start addressing guard positions which are harder to come by through free agency. If you know they want to do that from the defensive perspective, then maybe you cut ties with Khalil Mack, start to build from this linebacking group down, and then you could have a much younger look to your front seven, and then as well as your secondary, where you already started to get younger there as well, with guys like Still and Hart. So I'm really intrigued to see how they navigate that situation, because of what they might be trying to do in terms of getting more youthful. But let me know what you think of this Chargers team in off-season, in free agency, because coming up next we transition to another team, the Denver Broncos, really coming very far ahead in their rebuild. Bo Nix turning out to be an elite QB. Well, not necessarily an elite one, but still a competent one after a rough start to his NFL career. But let's see how they can improve on this season and try and bolster their roster as much as possible while Bo Nix is on a team-friendly deal. You don't want to miss it right after this short break.